This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 439, The Archaeological Holmes. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
Bert, I dig it. I dig it. You get it?
Oh, don't pull that stone, Dr. Jones. Oops, never mind.
Well, you look great in your fedora and your leather jacket there, your whip by your side. You look like you're on an archaeological mission.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I show up at the supermarket wearing all this stuff, particularly the people in the produce department, they snicker. I hear snickers. Actually, I smell
Over
Snickers.
At the
I think
checkout line. Yeah.
I think they're by the checkout line. That's right.
I could just imagine you in the produce aisle, spotting the person picking up the last papaya, and you taking out your whip and whipping them on the wrist and flicking it out of their hand.
Whenever I wear the whip to the supermarket, occasionally a very strange person just sort of sidles up to me in the checkout line. It's very uncomfortable.
And who might that be?
Well, I couldn't say. I think it's the store manager, Damien.
Well, we're not here to talk about that kind of archaeological exploration. We're here to talk about one much more interesting that was first raised by Poul and Karen Anderson in 1972. This isn't typically one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes, but we wanted to use this article from the March 1972 Baker Street Journal as a point of inspiration to talk a little bit about Sherlock Holmes and his archaeological tendencies, specifically with regard to one particular case. Which case is it? Well, you'll have to stay tuned to find out. Meanwhile, we just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to support the show, you can do that in a couple of ways, either on Substack or on Patreon. We have links to both of our presences there in the show notes at trifles.substack.com and patreon.com/trifles. You can find extra content, bonus material, and over on Patreon, you can even find thank you gifts at certain levels because we appreciate your patronage. We also have extra offerings like Trifling Trifles, the episodes that are a little shorter in nature that cover topics that don't deserve a full-blown episode like this one. So check that out and see what works for you. And thank you for your support. Okay, Bert, well, we find ourselves, deep in the pages of the BSJ, but it also takes us out to a certain area of England. Set the stage for us. Where are we going and what are we investigating?
Well, we are going to touch on one of Holmes's strangest cases. In fact, when you ask Sherlock Holmes about this case, he would identify it as the strangest case I've handled. It's the Devil's Foot out in Cornwall, where he has the mysterious events in Tredennick Walla and the odd death of Brenda Tregennis and strange fate of her brothers. And this is a mysterious area. Holmes, of course, is under the seriously constrained. He's near a nervous breakdown. And for the first time we hear, and the only time we hear, he's actually consulted the famous Harley Street specialist, Dr. Moore Agar, who's requiring him to take, who's prescribed a complete rest and relaxation. And so for Sherlock Holmes, what does that mean? Does that mean the Turkish bath, the south of France, off to the British seaside? No. Rest and recreation? Of course. The ancient Chaldean language out in Cornwall and some strange researches. And the folks who've given us this are Poul Anderson and Karen Anderson. As some of you may know, Poul Anderson was one of the most remarkable and noted science fiction writers. And his early stuff appeared in, one of all those terrific magazines, Astounding Fiction and things like that. He was born in 1926, and he was a Baker Street irregular. And he was called, among other things, science fiction's best storyteller. He was a founding member of the Society for Creative Anachronism, one of my favorite groups, and the Swordsmen and Sorcerers Guild of America. And he was wonderful, a regular and a wonderful science fiction writer.
And Karen Anderson was a co-founder of the Red Circle of Washington, D.C., and I sat next to her at one BSI dinner, and she was telling me how she originated filk music. You familiar with filk music?
Filk music? Never heard of it.
Yeah, I think it's something like, it was supposed to be folk music, but it was a typo. But filk music, I'm trying to remember what filk music was all about. It was basically, I think, in conjunction with science fiction and fantasy and horror, kind of in that genre. It's existed since around the mid 1950s, which would have been about the time Karen co-founded the Red Circle. But it actually originally was a typographical error, and it goes back to 1955, I think. Anyway, we're getting off here, but filk songs come from its cultural roots in the fandom, and they honor works of science fiction and fantasy and horror and speculative fiction. So that world that Paul and of course now Karen were inhabiting was celebrated by these songs that were created.
Well, now what's happened to that? I'd love to hear some of those songs.
That's a good question, and that's a rabbit hole I'm not prepared to go down at this point.
Okay, further research is required.
Yeah,
isn't that funny though? Filk, it was a typo. That's really funny. The British comic Spike Milligan years ago introduced himself once as Spike Maligna, the famous typing error.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, anyway, off to the Archaeological Holmes, which appeared in the March 1972 issue, volume 22, number 1 of the Baker Street Journal. And because we're dealing here with two literary people, fine writers, this is an enormous amount of fun in terms of looking at it from the construction and the sentence quality and the words. And of course, we begin, like many of the Sherlock Holmes cases, with conversation. Paul and Karen Anderson begin by quoting the issue around Holmes's trip to Cornwall. It was then, in the spring of the year 1897, that Holmes's iron constitution showed some symptoms of giving way in the face of constant hard work of a most exacting kind, writes Dr. Watson, adding the intriguing phrase, aggravated perhaps by occasional indiscretions of his own.
Uh-oh.
What indiscretions? The chronicler, preserving discretion, says not, nor shall we for the nonce, and likewise we shall refrain from wondering about the next sentence. In March of that year, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street, whose dramatic introduction to Holmes I may some day recount, etc., etc., etc.
Love Moore Agar. So Holmes is there on an R&R trip because he's been overdoing it in some ways. And I think we all know what ways that is, what way that is. But in doing so, in taking up his residency in Cornwall for, I don't know, how long were they there? Was it weeks? Was it days?
Oh, I think well, that's a good question. The case does not take that long. The case takes certainly days.
Yeah.
But how long they were in Cornwall, that's another question.
But while he was there, Holmes was investigating the Chaldean roots of the Cornish language. And the ancient Cornish language is an intriguing one, because this part of England, this is the southwest of England, almost out on a peninsula, and it's far removed from where the Romans came ashore in Londinium, over in the southeastern quadrant of the island. And very unique and different people out in this area that settled it. And this is what Holmes is researching, the language roots to the ancient Cornwall people.
And this is the issue that Poul and Karen Anderson dig into with us. Exactly what was the nature of this archaeological interest Holmes has? Because when he gets to Cornwall, he makes the acquaintance of the vicar, Mr. Roundhay, who shares Holmes's archaeological bents. And so, this is basically the question. Watson tells us Holmes was deeply interested in the local traces of some vanished race which had passed utterly away and left as its sole record strange monuments of stone, irregular mounds which contained the burned ashes of the dead, and curious earthworks which hinted at prehistoric strife. The glamour and mystery of the place, with its sinister atmosphere of forgotten nations, appealed to the imagination of my friend, and he spent much of his time in long walks and solitary meditations upon the moor. And there you have, in just those 3 sentences, a wonderful sketch by Watson that gives you exactly the mood and the visual image of Holmes in long walks, seen from a distance under a cloudy sky, solitary meditations upon the moor, and the mystery of this vanished race. What could they have been about?
Yeah, and Paul and Karen mentioned that as lonely as these relics may be, they're not that isolated. These are things we can see all around Europe. And medieval Europeans forgot that their ancestors built these things. They attributed supernatural origins to them, and they bestowed fantastic names on them, like Giant's Dance for what we now call Stonehenge. But by Holmes's time, they knew that there must be some mundane explanation for this rather than a supernatural one. But they really didn't know what the details were. And the ancient language, Watson tells us, the ancient Cornish language had also arrested his attention, which he had, I remember, conceived the idea that it was akin to the Chaldean and had largely derived from the Phoenician traders in tin. He received a consignment of books upon philosophy and was settling down to develop this thesis when suddenly, to my sorrow and unfeigned delight, that's when Reverend Roundhay came into the picture. So Holmes had his task in front of him about looking at the ancient language as part of the origins of the people in this area.
Now, Poul and Karen Anderson tell us, Holmes' interest in other aspects of history and philology is well proven, for example, by his research on early English charters, or by the considerable range of languages he must have commanded in order to travel as far and effectively as he did after Professor Moriarty's demise. It was quite in character for him to be intrigued by more distant, purely scientific problems, such as the one Watson here records. But the moment we consider it at face value, we see that it is a pseudo-problem, Untalented amateurs like us can almost instantly show how flimsy any speculation is about a connection between Chaldea and Cornwall. How much more quickly would not Sherlock Holmes reach the same conclusion? And yet we know that he found something of this nature worthy of his continued attention. This could not be because his intellect was temporarily enfeebled. It was in this exact period that he brilliantly solved the Devil's Foot mystery. Therefore, as often in the canon, we must look for a substratum, for the reality which underlies the writing. And let us begin with the elementary demonstration that what appears in print is indeed merely appearance. And I love that, and I wanted to read that sort of word for word from Poul and Karen Anderson's essay here, because it's just so beautifully written and beautifully constructed. Takes you right through the thinking, and deals with this whole issue, and then says, okay, well, let's begin with the elementary demonstration that what appears in print is indeed merely appearance. And I love this whole observation about we must look for the substratum.
The substratum, yeah, which is very archaeological.
Yeah.
Now, just to set the stage, Chaldea was part of the ancient Babylonian Empire. So it would have been bordered by the lower Euphrates, the head of the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Desert. Originally what is now, at least in 1972, Arabic or Kurdish country. And that's where the ruling class came from. And then Chaldea proper is cut off from the sea routes of the old tin trade. And Holmes using Chaldea for Babylon is kind of what bridges the gap here on how the tin trade would have made sense. But neither the ancient Babylonians or their Assyrian successors were seafarers because the empires didn't border on the Mediterranean except for a few brief times when coastal cities might be under tribute. So Holmes said he was aware of this when he mentioned the Phoenician traders in tin as being actual carriers of those Chaldean routes north to Cornwall. And the Phoenicians now were the intrepid mariners, and they would have spoken the same kind of language, a Semitic language, it rooted in ancient Hebrew and whatnot. And it's plausible that the city Tyre was under considerable Babylonian influence and would have been about 2000 BC, and that's when the tin trade would have been going on with Britain.
Oh, I just love that. They drop in so beautifully and clearly these little archaeological facts that clearly they have both researched and understand. But while these data doubtless intrigued Holmes, they write, he must soon have perceived as he studied further that the connection is too tenuous, that Babylonian influence did not last very long or go very deep, and the Phoenician language was always quite distinct. Though it was probably distinctly related to Chaldean, it was not descended from it, and therefore could not have transmitted any Chaldean roots. Phoenician is a Greek name. The people of city-states like Tyre and Sidon called themselves Canaanites, as we see in the Bible. Their language was extremely close to the ancient Hebraic. We find this likewise in the Old Testament, from the ease with which Hebrew and Canaanite talked, if not always got along with each other, though Holmes admitted on a different occasion that his biblical knowledge was a trifle rusty. He could not have overlooked this point.
And so they say they toyed for a while with Anglo-Israelitism, and they ruled that out after a while. And they said that to prove this, we don't need to invoke the results of physically examining strange monuments of stone or regular mounds or curious earthworks. Philology itself will serve. Philology. So they go, let's look about look at the truth about the Cornish language. Apart from a few words surviving in dialect, it became extinct in the late 18th century. So it's preserved in 3 medieval miracle plays in 13th century vocabulary and other fragments. And they show that it belonged to the Cymric division of the Celtic languages, together with Welsh and, Armorican. I don't know if that's supposed to be American, like folk. Those Americans and their filk music. No. These were Indo-European, from Transalpine Europe at that. So if they picked up a few Semitic loanwords, it would have come from a long overland route via Greece or Italy, which corresponds to the dilution of those words in the Cornish language at some point. So they said, no, Semitic roots in Cornish are simply out of the question. It's even unlikely that the Phoenicians furnished any loanwords. The Tin Islands, which they regularly visited, appear to have been the Scillies or Scillies, Scillies. He's a silly man.
Silly man. It's just magnificent, and in fact, one of the lovely things that they just touched on very quickly is an idea I never heard of, Anglo-Israelitism, which was the idea that for a certain time around Holmes's period, there was a vogue idea that the ancient Britons derived from the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which I had never heard of. But anyway, they've taken us, as you say, through all of this, particularly the language and the Semitic roots in Cornish and so on. And I didn't realize that the Cornish language became extinct in the late 18th century, apart from a few words surviving in dialect. Anyway, they say all of these facts were readily available as far back as 1897. Thus, it appears impossible so astute a reasoner as Holmes could long have entertained any thought of Chaldean influence on Cornwall. The idea might have crossed his mind, but as soon as he delved into a few authoritative books, he would have dismissed it. Nevertheless, the matter continued to engage him. Why? What is the substratum? Well, then they say, we told you that there's indeed a tin trade between the Mediterranean and Britain. It didn't originate with the Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians actually inherited some fragment of this whole enterprise, which had been more far-flung, ranging on into the Baltic Sea in quest of amber. And as we've seen, maintaining communications with the Far East. The most spectacular evidence for this is that chain of megalithic works already described, these stone structures. Their functions must have been primarily religious. Evidently, missionaries accompanied the merchant skippers of the great civilization in an age when Northern Europe was still using stone, though the South knew bronze.
And Holmes would have known about the ancient trade in amber. There were amber objects unearthed in Egypt. And Holmes concluded correctly that some traveled in ships, which also did business in Cornish tin. But who were the traders, they ask? And here they go on a little bit of a digression. They talk about visiting Stonehenge and being fortunate enough to photograph something that is almost impossible to capture, that the light has to fall just right. And this wasn't actually known to science, they say, until about 1950, when someone chanced to examine a picture taken under ideal conditions. They are incised images of a dagger and a double-bitted axe. And they say that it was probably carved when Stonehenge was given its present form, about 1450 BC. So the tribes there didn't have the precise detailed knowledge, but they understood that they could hire experts from the high civilization of the South, whose merchants had long been coming to trade for tin furs, slave girls, and other comforts. So they could have hired them to help contribute to Stonehenge there. And would Holmes have traveled to Stonehenge at some point? Likely. And if he was there, do you think he would have seen those symbols, that bitted axe and a double-bitted axe and the dagger? Of course he would have seen those things, they say.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So, they've taken us down this little tiny rabbit hole. Holmes might have observed that the megalithic circles were an observatory, but we don't have to get into that. All we need state is that he saw the trademark of the architect. And now we have more history. They write, a few years before the Devil's Foot episode, Arthur Evans began his excavations at Knossos on the island of Crete, and they were to go on for some 2 decades. But he found the beginnings of a powerful Bronze Age society, a maritime culture, and these are the Minoans. In fact, that Minoan realm was more cosmopolitan than any other was to be after it fell, until well into Roman times. Now, the evidence for all of this was not in as early as 1897, but there were strong indications at least Holmes would surely have remembered noticing the double axe chiseled on Stonehenge, when now he read that the same axe was the most vital token of a remarkable ancient Crete. He could at once, very reasonably, have visualized a network of trade, religion, even language, which reached north to include the Cornish moors, whereon he wandered. At first, the archaeological expert Evans assumed that the Cretans had been a pre-literate people, but in 1893 he found inscriptions in a kind of hieroglyphic unrelated to the Egyptian, and then from 1894 on he began to find linear as well as pictorial writing. And so let us assume that Holmes, more or less idly, remarked to Watson that perhaps there were Chaldean roots in the Cornish speech. It's a striking phrase that would take hold in Watson's mind. Holmes then set himself to study the matter, saw his original notion was absurd, but it also put him on the track of something far more interesting. The Chronicle suggests Watson got no hint that Holmes was changing his mind, because he probably spoke less than usual. He was recovering from a close brush with a nervous breakdown.
Yeah. So after the case was over, Holmes may have mentioned the Cretan roots of the Cornish language, but Watson, of course, already had Chaldean planted in his mind, and that's what stuck. And Paul and Karen wonder about the justification of this second theory, the Cretan theory. And they kind of play it out. They said it meets the same objections as the Phoenician, but a change occurred. About 1950, there was some work on a branch of the language that later Minoans spoke, or at least wrote, in a version of Greek. And Greek, like Celtic, is an Indo-European language, and thus it's related to Proto-Cornish and capable of supplying it with its root words. So they pick up on that branch of the language and say, this is how it became possible.
Well, it's amazing. Doubtless Holmes lacked the time, energy, background of accumulated knowledge to anticipate a lot of the subsequent discovery in the 20th century that proved the later Minoans spoke, or at least wrote, in a version of Greek. And Greek, of course, like Celtic, is an Indo-European language, and therefore it's related to the Proto-Cornish, and so on and so forth. His current residence in Cornwall, his memories of Stonehenge and other archaeological sites and finds could have suggested the rest of a daring hypothesis to him. After all, as far as we can tell today, it's by no means impossible that Homeric-speaking Cretans around the 15th century left not only their physical mark at Stonehenge, but some trace of their language in Cornish.
And so Holmes anticipated this discovery, well, then, 3/4 of a century ago. And Paul and Karen admit that art in the blood takes the strangest forms. Not only did the stage lose a great actor when he became a detective, science lost a great archaeologist. I don't know about you, Bert, but it's all Chaldean to me.
Well, it's a wonderful essay, where Paul and Anderson just take us through this argument, clearly delighting in their own research and connecting these things together. And of all these kinds of things we tend to explore, it's lovely to realize that, after all, this is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
We can talk.
Well, thank goodness.
After the episode ended, the conversation kept going. And just for you, because you're a supporter of our show, we have this bonus material.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
In the early 1950s, the term filk music started as a misspelling of folk music in an essay by Lee Jacobs. And the essay was The Influence of Science Fiction on Modern American Filk Music. Rye Ballard, then editor of Spectator Amateur Press Society, refused to publish it for the fear that the article's bawdy content could get them in trouble with the post office under the Comstock laws. But
If you'd like to hear the rest of this bonus content, simply sign up as a paid subscriber.